Today we're going to talk about using the wall of truth. We call it getting to the truth, and a lot of you may be familiar with using the wall of truth and using the term, but today I'm going to encourage you to take it to the next level, just like we always do here at Quartet Group. The motivation behind this, of course, once again, we have the 4 elements of a winning proposal. We like to keep it fairly simple, straightforward. I know some people have 7, some people have 11 elements. I find it difficult to understand beyond 4, so I just keep it down to that number. You want to be compliant, obviously, follow all instructions. We've been talking a lot about that in the past in previous webinars. You obviously want to score well. You want to score blue in the case of the Color Achievable scoring system, or 100 points if it's NASA. And in order to do that, you have to write to the evaluation criteria. You have to show the key facts and data that will present your offer in the best possible light and convince the customer that you meet and exceed their criteria. Of course, you want to demonstrate low proposal risk. So that's one of the things that the wall of truth will help us with as we try to conform the horizontal integration across these volumes. Make sure that there's consistency across everything, and I'm talking about going from technical management, the schedule, the program plan, all the way into the cost volume, including the basis of estimates that you may be writing for your justify your cost. And of course, the compelling offer, and this is another way that the wall of truth can help you by writing down those factoids and the clear statements that are the strategy-driven statements you want to get across in the proposal. We can always refer to the wall of truth to extract those and put those in appropriate places. So once again, the wall of truth is a tool, and how much you put into it and how much you get out of it is strictly up to you. But one of the things you want to think about when you're doing a wall of truth is, what are the key reasons? Number one, we mentioned, was driving out inconsistencies. Inconsistencies are one of the easiest problems for all evaluators to find, and when they find them, they have documented evidence right in front of them, where you might say, we had 4 units over here and 2 in the schedule, and maybe another number in the cost volume. And as you can think about that, you'll realize that those are very difficult to fix, right? So if we're going to go and adjust cost and change the numbers in the cost, that's a major deal. We're going to have to go in and rewrite BOEs and run the cost numbers again, something you may not want to do. So the tendency is always to align everything to what you said in the cost volume, which then may introduce risk in the technical side. If you needed those units for testing and now you don't have them, you may have another problem on your hands beyond just an inconsistency. Another thing is author angst. We got a lot of people coming in as authors on a proposal. There's usually a lot of first-timers that come in. They don't know what to do. They don't know why they're there, except that their bosses told them to show up and work on for the duration. What we want out of authors is for them to focus on the content. That's the part we cannot provide. What is the technical truth and justice? What is the answer that we want to find? Those are the things that we want them to bring forward. However, in the course of working with us and in the proposal environment, they tend to get easily frustrated. What frustrates them, first thing, is the old format problem, right? Their difficulty using Word or doing things in Word or any other desktop publishing program. They'll find that difficult, and that will bring them to a halt quickly when their art pops all over the place, and we will have to go in and deal with that. They don't understand proposals. This is not a report. We keep telling them this is a sales document, and they don't exactly know what that means. After all, they've been dealing with engineering for most of their lives, and now all of a sudden they're thrown into something that they're really not used to doing. And of course, if they don't have the key facts in front of them, especially those that come out of the higher levels of strategy, they'll get frustrated because they want to put an answer in there, but they can't do it. They'd rather be technically correct, and so they come to a grinding halt. So one of the things you can do is put things in the wall of truth that helps them, that they can pull the data from, that they can see the words and the styles and the way to the nomenclature that they should be using. And so as such, the wall of truth will provide that definitive source of information that you can create and keep up to date. You put data in there that people can extract, that they can use then to substantiate their claims. So with the wall of truth, we can do all sorts of things that will help the writers. What parts of the wall of truth should you consider? Well, first of all, there's the proposal style guide. There's nomenclature in there and all sorts of other things. We could spell this all out for them and have them avoid trying to sit there and figure it out on their own. The go-to shop for whatever they need in terms of proposal style. Names and how to use them and when to use them. Names are often confusing. What do we call the customer? What do we call ourselves? Let's nail that down, put that in the wall of truth so everybody is using the same nomenclature when they're referred to names. There's interaction. There's interaction with the government, with our customer. There's interaction across the team. There may be interaction with other parts outside the customer who we have to go deal with. There are places where things get done and by whom. What are those places and how are you going to refer to them in the proposal? As a key thing you want to document in the wall of truth. Once again, that also could be strategy driven, so you want to make sure you understand that. Things, what are the things that we're making? What are the things that we're delivering? Are they hardware? Are they software? Is it service? Is it a bunch of data items that we have to go do? And where do they come from? Along the course of being developed and fabricated, assembled, integrated, and tested, where do they come from? How do they come together? Then you want to talk about dates, when things occur, government dates, your dates, things like that. You want to write to them consistently across the proposal. So the best thing to do is put those dates into the proposal, into the wall of truth, and then you can copy them into the proposal as required. Another area is standards. Standards are things that you may want to make up or reuse across your proposal that help you reinforce your position. So you may be talking about technology readiness levels, which is an accepted standard. And so you may need to define the details of the TRLs so that your folks in your organization know exactly where to place the technology when they're doing their assessments. And then, of course, we have commitments, where key strategy-driven decisions for the win that we somehow have to sit there and convey somewhere in the proposal. Because after all, this is what we think is most important to the customer. They ought to be able to see it clearly, and they ought to be able to see it unambiguously so that they understand what that commitment is. Style guides. Style guides usually start off with a long list of do's and don'ts, right? We live with this every day. It's easy for us because we're writing in proposal style all the time. But everybody else who comes in, they don't. And so let's make it easy on everyone else and write it down and tell them this is how we want them to do things. So usually I start off the first page with a three-column table, do use, do not use, and examples, right? And then below that, I'll start off with numbers, right? How do we want them to refer to currency? How do we want them to refer to phone numbers? Dates, units. What is the format for each one of those that you want people to follow? So, you know, just thinking about dates, is it month, day, year? Is it day, month, year? Is it spelled out year? Is it all numbers? Is it slashes? Whatever the format that you come up with, write it down so everybody talks to the same style when they're going through this. It'll also help you when you're cleaning things up. You want to add the standard phrasing below that table. We like to use instead of utilize, although there are exceptions, and so the reason why the example is on the right column is so that you can put in those exceptions when you want them to use utilize instead of use. Define those standard acronyms. Is it SOW all caps, or is it small O in the middle? Is it HW or H/W when you talk about hardware? Those would be the standard acronyms you want them to use. And don't forget your customer, and don't forget other parts throughout the proposal that you want standard acronyms to be used. And oh, by the way, you want to tell people that once you've defined an acronym this way, you do not want them to redefine it in a different way, and they'll have to come up with something different. And then, of course, we finish off the list with the style guide with a writing style. Present tense, first person, active voice, message location. Where do you put the message? We always like to put the message of a sentence at the end. That's the thing that you're most likely to remember after finishing reading a sentence. And we provide instructions and examples. And always remember, you're trying to convey to your authors that they have to speak to the customer. Not inside. It's not an internal thing. This is going outside and representing your company as one of the first products in this job you're trying to win. So let's talk about the customer, and that goes into this area of what's in a name. So we talked about adding names to the list. What about the customer? And you have to decide, what are you going to call each of the customers? If you have a relatively small customer, 95% of your interaction is going to be with those in the acquisition office, the program office that wrote the RFP, that's conducting the evaluation, the people that are going to determine whether or not you met the statement of work as you work throughout the contract. As an example, in a very large program, the acquisition office plays a very important role, but they are just one part of many that are in the customer shop. And in this particular case, I'll use the C-17, the big cargo lifter that the Air Force bought years ago. That was purchased by Air Force Material Command out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. They're the ones that purchase all Air Force aircraft. So they're the ones that ran the competition, and they're the ones that buy the aircraft. The contract comes from them, and the day-to-day management of the contract with the prime contractor is conducted by the acquisition office. On the other hand, there's the operator. So when the C-17 gets built, who is the actual operator? In this particular case, it's the Air Force Mobility Command. They operate, maintain the aircraft. Okay, so once it's delivered to the customer and turned over, the operator takes control of it, and they're the ones that then go and use it for whatever mission it was intended. Now, you may think in the case of the C-17 that the Air Force pilot that sits in the front is the user, but generally that is not true. As a matter of fact, the C-17 was created at the behest of the Army. The Army is the prime user of C-17s. They needed to carry tanks, helicopters, and other stuff. So you could say the warfighter, okay, or you could talk about a brigade commander or whatever. The issue here is you would like to try to be specific when you're talking about it. Is it that gunnery sergeant that's going to lead the squad, or is it going to be the general who is sitting there getting ready to launch aircraft? So you want to be specific about the user you're talking to. Then you have the planner. The planner is the one who figures out how we're going to fight, where we're going to fight, and those are the service vice chiefs who jointly come together and form the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. They're the ones that define the needs, the operational needs, that determines how much airlift to go where and in how much time. So they were the ones that decided basically the operational need for the C-17 aircraft, which was then translated into a number of aircraft with a certain range and a certain speed to capable of carrying this stuff so far and delivering so many troops to the action. The budgeters are the ones in the DoD Controller's Office or the Office of Management Budgets that request the monies. So the year-to-year funding comes out of those folks, and they have to work with the acquisition office to get those needs in front. But in the end, there's going to be a balancing act across programs, and they're going to move forward with a combined budget request to the president. And then, of course, there's the bill payers, because Congress is going to ultimately decide how much and when. So when we're talking to these people, it's particularly if you want a large development program, you have to recognize that each one of these customers is going to weigh in on your acquisition and weigh in on who wins. So you want to be careful about who you talk about and how you're going to talk about them. A great place to do that is in the Wall of Truth. So once you've defined your customer, the next thing you got to do is worry about yourselves. What do you call yourselves? Usually, you call yourself just the name of the prime contractor that's in charge. After all, they are the ones that are sitting there spending a lot of B&P to win the contract. But in the past, that's not always been the case. As companies come together and form joint ventures, as an example, they may name the joint venture and come up with a team name, if you will, that basically says that we're the guys that you want to go pick. So you got to figure out what do you call yourselves. And of course, you want to do that first, and then any shortened versions later on. This also comes down to company branding, so you have to go check the company branding to make sure you're using the right terms and conditions in your naming of yourselves. What are the other companies that work beside you? What is their name? What are you going to call them when you introduce them? So if you have a major teammate, you have to be very careful, because usually that implies there's a teaming agreement in place. They have a defined role on this effort and potentially other programs. As an example, you might have teamed for somebody to provide all of your engines, and that teaming relationship covers a lot of different programs as you move forwards. And customers usually want to know about that, right? Because your relationship has basically locked them into buying that particular engine. So they want to know about that, and they usually request you to describe, if you have any teammates, and what other conditions associated with the teaming arrangements. So you have to be careful when you have teammates, or calling someone a teammate who is not. Subcontractors generally have a contract, a statement of work, and they have a spec, and they do a finished product, which is tested, inspected, whatever, or they do a major chunk of the work that's associated with the statement of work, and that work journal flows directly to the prime level. Vendors, they build the print items or catalog items. You're going to buy a server, you want 500 of them, and they're usually coming from companies that are vetted, and they provide completed components built to a catalog item or something like that, and generally their cost is treated differently than, let's say, the subcontractors. You could also have a very interesting relationship with a small business. In that particular case, there's mentor-proteges possibilities, where you can get a lot of points with the small business folks for having a protege as a small business, and that you're trying to mentor them up and help them grow and become relevant in the DoD world, something that small business people are really anxious to do. And then, of course, you have to decide what you're going to call your competition, if at all. Sometimes we don't want to mention them. Sometimes we just call them the honored competition or whatever. But define that rule, because somehow you're going to want to ghost your competitor. And how are you going to do that? How are you going to refer to that? It needs to be defined by somebody and written down in the wall of truth. What about your program award? First of all, the customer usually wants to know who is the #1 guy on your program. And whatever the customer calls that position, you're going to call them that and nothing else. If they want a program manager, that is what we call it. It's a program manager. Here's Joe Blow, Susie Two Shoes, whatever it is, you're going to call that person a program manager. Why? Because you want to present a customer-facing organization. After all, if they wanted a vice president, they would have asked for one in the RFP. So let's give them what they asked for. What your internal things are is not as important. Next, what are all those execution teams down below, those little boxes we draw on an org chart? What do we call those? Are they IPTs? Are they functional teams? Working groups? Or late night, one frustrated author decided to call them random nodes of work prior to Pink Team. Yes, random nodes of work. We didn't put that in there, but you have to define what they are and what you name them. So if you have IPTs, then you should have an engineering IPT or this IPT or that IPT. And you ought to be consistent about that across the board. What do you call the folks that lead those teams? Okay, so generally those people's names are going to appear in those org charts, and you want to call them something. They could be IPT leads if you have IPTs. If they're functional teams, they might be functional managers. It might be a chief engineer that you put in charge of them. So once again, you want to be that, you want to name that position so that you can refer to that, especially when you start talking about plans, program management plans, system engineering management plans. You put an org chart there in somebody's name, but you're always going to talk to the position. The chief engineer is the one who makes the decision. Whoever the program manager designates, the chief engineer will make this decision. So that's why we talk about titles. And the terms of the titles are customer-facing organizations. I don't know how many times I got assignments from my boss who gave me a title because that's what the customer wanted. I never really had a business card with a title, but I had a lot of different things that he called me as I went from program to program, and depending on what the customer was asked for, that was what I was when I showed up. Make sure you introduce yourself that way. So your internal titles generally matter at your internal annual review, but customers really don't care what that is. They'd like to know that somebody's really important and he reports to somebody, but generally they don't care what you call yourselves, levels or whatever. That's all internal to you. If there's anything below those top-level functional teams, what do we call them? Are they sub-IPTs? Are they level 2 IPTs? Or what are they? You just need to sit there and think about what you're going to call them so everybody can call them the same thing across the proposal. How do we interact with this customer? What is the nature of the interaction? I'm going to start talking about a lot of different questions now that I want you to consider as you go forward in dealing with the wall of truth on your next proposal. What is the nature of the interaction that you're having? Is it a regular meeting? Is it a working group? Is it as required? Does it just somebody calls up and says we need a meeting? Is it triggered by another event? Do you conduct a failure review board on a regular basis, or do you conduct a failure review board upon the initiation of a failure report? These are the things that you can define up front and say this is how it works. Then, of course, how often, right? So you have daily phone calls, weekly meetings on webinars or whatever, on online system, monthly get-togethers face-to-face, and maybe quarterly with senior management. Whatever it is, you want to define business rhythms or battle rhythms and explain how that's going to occur. What is the purpose of your meeting? Is it a regular agenda or is it a decision-making review? Who has to attend? The chair is Mr. Manager, supported by subject matter experts, or is the meeting co-chaired by the government PCO and somebody else? So once again, you come into that, and once again, we're interested in the titles, not necessarily the names of the people, but the functional organizations, the leads that are responsible for attending these interactions. How does information get distributed? Do you log on to a dashboard and see that there's a meeting coming up? Do you get an email? Can you request the data? Does it ship to you? Is it emailed to you? Or can you go onto a website and download the charts? Key questions you want to sit there and answer. Where do things occur? Now this gets into a real strategy discussion. If your strategy wants to convey that somehow we're all one big happy family co-located in some region of the country, then you're going to be a little bit more vague about your position. So you might say Greater Washington, D.C. area is where we're at because you've got a lot of teammates or subcontractors that are within 10, 15, 20 miles of you. And the Greater D.C. area covers a lot of ground and makes you sound like you are really co-located, even if you're not really there. Or you could actually give a specific address, 1060 East Imperial Highway, El Segundo, California, where I used to work. You can find it on a map, and you can know where you got to go when you're going to a meeting. There'll be somebody there in the lobby to greet you and guide you to the right meeting place. Do you spread money around? Once again, a key consideration in the strategy could be how I'm spreading the contract dollars around to as many congressional districts or whatever. These can have very good political implications, and so you want to sit there and discuss that. When things move, how do they do that? What things have to move and where and why? Are you buying subsystems, assemblies, or whatever from a lot of different companies, and therefore it's all got to come together? Think of the logistics that a company like Boeing goes through when they're making the 787, and parts have to be shipped in from all over the world and coordinated in order for them to meet the production schedule. Okay, you may not have the same magnitude of a problem, but it's certainly an easy thing to write down how all that occurs so that everybody can write to it in the same way. And there will be no ambiguity to how things will actually occur. Are you located near any of the customers? If so, what is the functions, the roles, responsibilities of the locals? Are they there to facilitate meetings? Are they there to deliver mail? Are they there to get the inside scoop from the customer? Are they allowed to make decisions for you? What is their role and responsibility when they go and do that? It's particularly important when you're talking about the back end of the program where you're actually going to potentially deploy something, and there may be a lot of subcontractors that are supporting you. Let's talk about the system hierarchy. When you got the RFP, what does it say they wanted you to make? Was it a system? Was it a subsystem? Was it a piece of avionics? What exactly is that they asked for? And then what is the system hierarchy below that? If you were asked to build a system, you might have a series of subsystems that make up that system. If you're asked to make a subsystem, you might have a series of assemblies or subassemblies that make up the subsystem. It might even be boxes or units or whatever it is. But the important thing is that you define what it is, because that determines a lot of scope on the program. Systems engineering is going to have to sit there and write specs and interface control documents every time you parse the system into smaller and smaller pieces until you get down to the unit level. And then, of course, the amount of testing and integration that has to occur to bring all those disparate pieces together into a unified system that is fully vetted, operational, that also implies a lot of scope. So also in the costing, if you start talking about how prices come in and how they are captured, once again, what you name something could be critical, and go check the pricing and see if that has any kind of implication to what you're calling this unit, part, what have you. And then, of course, you want to sit there and define what's required at each level. So how many subsystems are there? How many parts are fabricated and inspected, if that's the case? You get those kinds of statistics, and now it generates a feeling that you actually understand exactly the scope of what it's going to take to sit there and do this job. So defining the system hierarchy is one of the things you want to do, and get that from engineering. What do we deliver, when, and how? So once again, if they asked for a system, that may be the what, And then, of course, the when and how many they want is carried in the RFP. Section D with the supplies and services, we've all looked at that. We look at the CLIN structure and see what CLINs apply to what fiscal year and to what scope of work. But that generally is where you can start and find out what they want. The deliveries of performance in Section F will define when. They summarize a simple list and post that so that everybody knows the first unit they want in FY whatever, and then you can actually put the real date that you're going to sit there, the need date versus the committed date. How about all the data items that are in Exhibit A, the Seadrill list? I like to summarize that as part of my shred operation and provide a simple list and post it. How about the stuff they forgot to put in? You got to consider the possible implications of what you're building. So if you're building a development program, are you doing breadboards early? Why? Are you building engineering models or qualification models? What does that mean, and how do you use those? How many do you deliver and when? If you're in a production program, okay, I don't need to know the exact schedule when 175 of these things are going to be built, but I'd sure like to know when the first one's going to be delivered and when you think the last one's going to be delivered. Then we can bound the problem. And just when does that happen? Are you on a start date or days after contract award? Calendar schedule needs hard dates. You can assume a start date, work everything out from that. You got a Microsoft project schedule. You can put in the holiday schedule in there and count the number of business days. You can put in the key events and all the deliverables. So you can do all that stuff. An undefined start date, now you're talking about contract award, or days from contract award, or days from start. Once again, you got to get the term down. If they talk about days from contract award or days from authorization to proceed or whatever the term is, keep consistent. And of course, keep all these dates consistent throughout and always double check them. Customer dates for major activities, we know that they're going to change during the course of the program, but for right now, we just treat them as gospel. Major events, and of course you want to bound the delivery dates for the first and the last. Key dates to be wary of. These are the things that you don't want to tie your horse to. If you're thinking that you're going to tie program success to a milestone B or a milestone C, think about that again. You can be ready for a milestone C. You can do everything that the contractor can do to be ready for milestone C. But there's somebody up in the DoD that's going to schedule that milestone C, and it isn't going to be you, and it isn't going to be your program office. So you want to sit there and talk about being ready, but there probably will be a period of time between when you're ready and they actually conduct the meeting to declare victory and move on to the next phase of the program. IOC and FOC are the same thing. Initial operational capability is declared by the test and evaluation people, not you, not your customer, nobody else. And of course, in the old satellite world, we never tied ourselves to a launch date unless we did it ourselves. If we were doing the launch, we could commit to a launch date because we can control it. But satellite launches are generally performed by the government. Ship launches are major events with VIPs, and first flight of any aircraft is usually governed by weather, not you. So once again, you try to sit there and say, hey, here's when we're ready. So I just throw that in there because some people want to make commitments to dates they can't possibly control. Standards. Are you planning to reuse things? If so, write the standard down. Usually you can come up with 5 or 6 levels of reuse as long as you define what they are. Total reuse, half reuse, whatever the nomenclature you use, define the characteristics, write it down so everybody has it. You can apply that to documents, you can apply that to drawings, you can apply it to all sorts of things that you can use to reduce the scope, because after all, that's what reuse is trying to do. You're trying to drive down costs by avoiding work that you don't have to redo, so I'm going to reuse this work. Are you selling maturity? Once again, you can use technology readiness levels. They have definitions out there, but you got to put it in your own company's lexicon. What does that mean when you translate it? The internal company processes will say, hey, I've done that when I've done these 5 things. So you got to define that, and you got to write that down so everybody assesses to the same level. Once again, assessing to different levels and being consistent can open yourself up to a lot of questions that you'll have trouble trying to answer. You can also define new standards if you want. We encourage this, to go off and find new standards to help basically convince the customer that you should score blue in these areas by taking a subjective criteria and trying to turn it into an objective one. by having these standards in place. And of course, once you define them, write them down in the wall of truth so everybody applies them consistently. Same thing with confidence. Confidence gets into how much margin I need against my performance numbers. Commitments. Commitments are very important. These are the things that come from the strategy and requires careful definition, vetting by legal, contracts, and all the way up the management chain. And therefore, it is our duty to make sure that they are addressed consistently, correctly across the proposal. So we could commit to providing key personnel for so many months. Who are defined as the key personnel, and how do you refer to other folks in the program? Remember, you don't want to make the mistake of calling some person or some job key and having the government come back and say, hey, that person is key personnel because you said so in the prop, when that's not what you meant. So that's another reason why we want to control this and make sure that what we put in the wall of truth is the definitive statement. Pre-award investments, warranty or warrants are also potential commitments that we can make, and these are all carefully vetted and must be referred to properly and in the correct location. Maintain your wall of truth daily. I like to put it someplace where everybody can find it, and if they can't find it, I'm going to take screen captures or whatever. I know URLs work, but I like to do screen captures of where they can find things, going through the folder structure on the server, SharePoint, or what have you, whatever system they're making. Speak to it regularly. Announce those additions in the AM meeting, right? So I like to go from the capture manager to the program manager and then the proposal manager in my morning meetings. The proposal managers, one of their announcements are these wall of truth changes or wall of truth additions and any other red flag announcements that would tell you there's a major change on the program. Add what's important. I like to go to the capture plan and pull that good data. There's a lot of rationale for why we're going to win this job. Let's pull those statements into the wall of truth. Why hide it over in the capture plan when everybody's going to go check the wall of truth? Pull from the baseline definitions, those facts and data. They're the ones that are going to define how many subsystems go into this subsystem, and they're going to define what the names are. Of course, now you got to vet that against what the RFP calls things, because there may be some differences. Remember, what we call our stuff and what the customer is buying may be two different things. It may be just a nomenclature different, but in all cases, let's default to what the customer uses. When we go to the wall, I like to write stickies and put "See Wall of Truth," and I point an arrow right to the place. I know there's an error there, and it should be consistent with the wall of truth, and I ask people to go check it out. And my volume leads all know that's what I do, and they're going to sit there and say, did you go to the wall of truth? And of course, then I use it during the one voice edit if it's left to me, or the volume leads. As we go through, we'll have the wall of truth displayed right there, pinned up on the wall, so we can quickly go through and pull out the nuggets that should be in the sections but somehow did not get there. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions as I throw this back to Joe? Joe's not there.
Sorry, I'm coming off of mute. Can you hear me now, Jim?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. We got a bunch of questions. Thanks everybody for coming. First one's from John in Greenville. It was from slide 5, which is the style guide. It's actually a pretty basic question. I like it a lot. Why are some style guides marked proprietary?
Sometimes they will contain a proprietary name or something like that. I don't know. I have one that I generated, and if my client doesn't have it, I will start them off with a style guide. Usually the first thing they do is they say, no, we don't use dates that way. We do it a different way. I say, fine, go in and mark it up. So if it's proprietary, then you have to leave it there, and you can't use it anywhere else. But if not, what I do is just start with one, then after a large number of years, mine's getting a little long.
Next one is from Brian in New York City on slide 7, which is what's in a name. Do you recommend discussing the competition at all, particularly in a down select, so probably down to 3 or 2 competitors where people would probably know who you're talking about?
I'm mixed about that. I don't name competitors by their company names. I will refer to them as let me find an example. So I may say that they were the company responsible for the F-16 or something like that, the builder of the F-16. And that's about as close as I get. I usually don't name them by name, but some cases where I want to sit there, this is particularly true if you're going up against an incumbent, is they have a long track record and they've made mistakes. And one of the things you can do is avoid those mistakes and tell them why you're not avoiding the mistakes. And of course, you mentioned the mistake, as found on the solid rocket motor on the XYZ, whatever, you want to avoid that mistake. Well, your customer will know all about that typically, so you don't necessarily need to name them. But what you want to do is define how you're going to do that, right? So in that particular case, if somebody had a problem with a solid rocket motor on the Titan IV program, and you want to sit there and say why we don't do that, you can sit there and, in the wall of truth, define. We're allowed to say that we avoid problems encountered on the Titan IV solid rocket motor by the special mix that we use. Boom. And you can put that in the wall of truth as a context statement and say, if you use it in this context or a similar context, this is how you refer to those dirty, rotten bastards over in the competition.
The next question I'll go ahead and take. Yes, we actually post the webinars on our YouTube channel. My email is on the invitation. Just shoot me an email and I'll go ahead and shoot you the link. So if you want to show this to other people in your company, or you want to go back and look at the others, we'll give you what that link is. Next one's from Ray in Tampa on slide 11. In that system hierarchy, how is your system hierarchy different than your work breakdown structure or WBS?
Typically, the customer will typically start at the high levels of the WBS, even though they're down lower. What do I mean by that? Okay, so if you've got the WBS consistent with 882, is that what I remember? Mm-hmm. Usually that will start with, at the very hot, let's go to the aircraft level, right? So there's an aircraft and then there's this major subsystems that make up the aircraft, right? So the propulsion unit, the fire control systems, and all those other kinds of things are pretty well spelled out. But what happens typically is if you come in at let's say you're the power plant manufacturer, so you're the jet engine manufacturer, right? You're competing on the jet engine. The WBS will typically start at the same level. It'll start up at the very top. The customer is not trying to drive the WBS down to very, very low levels. It just makes them complex for them. So typically I find that they will reset the WBS back up at a high level, even though you might be down below a subsystem. You might be providing units or systems, a conglomeration of units or assemblies, and they'll just start the WBS at the top. The other thing is the system hierarchy is always different, okay? And each customer defines it differently. And it's different for hardware versus software-driven systems. So, CSCIs and CSCs, that's generally different than what we're doing over in on the hardware side. So I always find it interesting because if it's not properly defined, then we have inconsistencies of how we refer to something. Somebody will call it a unit, and another person will call it a part. And if they're talking about the same level of the system, then they should be the same term because they're usually treated the same way. And that's my only concern. You should always map to the WBS, but typically, like I say, the WBS will be reset at very high levels, even though it shouldn't be.
Great. Next one, and I'm sorry if I get the name wrong. Octavio from Boston. What is the most common errors that lead to proposal inconsistency that you see in your experience?
Numbers. And it's usually numbers of things. This is where we get tripped up. So I've got a development program. Let's say I'm making widgets, and it's an engineering manufacturing development program, so I'm expected to go through design reviews, and then I'm going to produce some of these initial widgets, prototypes they might be, and then the customer is going to test the widgets, right? I'm going to have to test the widgets. So I start sitting there and saying the government's pure need for widgets for their test is 10, and I come back and say my pure need for my widgets is 10. So I need 10 flight quality widgets, if you will, to support the test program. But I really need more than that, right? So I'm going to sit there and I'm going to have problems. I'm going to have failures. So I'm really going to have some spares in the background. And are those prototype units? And then, of course, I'm going to sit there and develop the widget. So I might have brass board units. All of a sudden now I've got this numerology problem of how many of what I'm making and for what purpose. And if I'm inconsistent between what I put in my technical volume as to why I put that in there, like if I said I need 10 units for my test program, and then all of a sudden I go to my schedule and I'm only showing 5, and then I go to my cost and I'm showing 7, that's one of the easiest things for them to pull out because they'll put the name in there. So they'll say, well, these are 10 contractor test units, and then they look for contractor test units, and they find the number 7, and then they find the number 5. And they say, what is it? What's the right number? Now you're stuck. Is it 10? You told them it was 10 because you wanted to mitigate the risk of not having enough units to test, something we're all very familiar with. But you went and priced 7, so you add cost over there, and now you got to go in and add 5 more to your schedule and show where they come from in a schedule that already looks pretty complex and pretty compact, and it may lead to the conclusion that you can't even make 10 in the time you got allotted. So by carefully working this out up front, you avoid the problem of the inconsistency of the number in the end game where it is very difficult to fix. Remember, you're going to get an EN on that, and I've seen it happen, and all of a sudden now we're going through and we're trying to sit there and fix the number 10 through the entire proposal. And my horror story was I did that exercise once where we had told the government a number of a certain kind of widget, and when I searched the proposal, we had used that phrase 29 times throughout the problem. And I had to go, one EN went and corrected 29 different places. And that led to another EN that says, well, now that you've fixed all that, what about the cost? Oh, crap. So, you know, it was a nightmare. So I would start with the numbers first. Start with the number of the units that you're making and how much work it is, and then make sure that that's consistent between your schedule and your cost.
And then sort of a follow-up question to that is inconsistency more common in working in virtual teams? Because, you know, right now a lot of writing is not co-located anymore. So.
And that is absolutely true. We try to combat that problem by putting everything on a wall, at least in the central location where the volume leads are and the main players are, but often that is not the case. And as a result, you're stuck with doing that in the end game. And if you haven't allowed enough time after red team for you to go through and clean up these problems, then you're going to be in trouble. So one of the things I like to do is I like there and have 2 during red team. So why don't you get your younger authors that still display a modicum of energy to do something and task them to do 2 things. Split them up into 2 teams. Number 1, go through the wall of truth and find all of these things. I actually have PDF the entire red team version. You need to do that to print easily anyway. And then put it in a folder and use the Adobe Acrobat features of an advanced find and search for the numbers through the entire proposal and find out where you found them and where there's inconsistencies. And I start with the number 0 and work my way up until I can't find any numbers anymore. Usually you run out at 25. So the second thing is set that second Tiger team up to do the compliance checks.
Right.
So if we did everything we said we would, then we ought to be able to go through and find the answers to every single question the customer asked in section L. Those people can actually put the page number from the red team version where they found the answer. Those 2 techniques work fairly well to solve these problems.
And that, it looks like it on the questions. I'll give everybody like 30 seconds real quick. And that doesn't look like anything else is coming in. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining the CoreTAC group on our training today. We will finish part 4 next month. And if you have any questions or you want to see the previous versions, go ahead and shoot me or Jim an email. Jim, if you want to just put back up your last slide so you get your email back up there. And we wanted to thank everybody for your time today. and coming, and hopefully we'll see you next month. So long, everybody. Thank you.